Chapter 12, Ecology. What I've done, guys, is I've divided this chapter into two presentations because the slide count is way over 120 slides. So I will present 63 slides here and then 63 slides in part 2. So this chapter includes so many topics: ecology and society, the science of ecology, abiotic factors, populations, population growth, human population growth, community interactions, food webs, species diversity, invasive species, biodiversity. And so I think we'll stop around here. I think invasive species is the end part of this first part. So let's continue going. The opening question is, ecology is every day. So ecologists study how organisms interact with each other and their environment. So it says here for an opening question, list all the organisms that you've interacted with over the last 24 hours. When I think back to who I've interacted with over the last 24 hours, I went to the store and saw some humans. I stayed at home and I interacted with my little weenie dog. And then I went in the front yard and actually pulled some weeds also. So I interacted with plants. So those are the organisms that I interacted with so far today. So what was the nature of the relationship, or was it positive or negative for both of you or for them? So I'm going to say I think everything was positive except for when I pulled weeds. It was negative for the plants. So how is it that we study ecology? It can be done in a couple of ways, but here are two ways. So ecology is the study of organisms and how they interact with each other and with their environment. So we can take a discovery approach and make observations out in the environment. There's no real treatments per se. Or we can have a hypothesis-driven approach, and those are the experiments like we do in lab. You can actually do experiments out in nature. Ecology can inform the philosophy and social movement of environmentalism. Now, your book makes a distinction between ecology and environmentalism. Environmentalism is a broad philosophy and social movement that seeks to maintain environmental quality, and a lot of that understanding of environmental quality comes from the study of ecology. So the science of ecology provides the basis of understanding environmental problems. So why do we study the environment anyway? Like, why is it so important? Well, we live in the environment. The environment produces a lot of materials that we use in our everyday lives. It actually cleans up things that have been polluted and makes them fresh again. It prevents erosion, and we use it for recreation. The other thing that we look for in the environment is its own intrinsic value. Like, that means it has maybe no value to humans, but it has values just being in itself. We also use the environment for scientific research. It sustains and defines cultures, and it's also a resource for teaching and learning. And sometimes these are more difficult to put value on. How much would you pay for ice cream? So the truth is that honeybees and native insects pollinate many of the crops that flavor our ice cream. Like, for example, strawberry and chocolate ice cream. Those are plant-based, and those plants need to be pollinated. So if we didn't have insects, how much would you pay to replace them for their service? And how would we go about doing it? So I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but if we didn't have bees and insects moving around on plants, like, how would they get pollinated? So we definitely need insects, and many of them are beneficial. Ecology can be studied at many levels. Again, ecology is the study of organisms interacting with each other and their environment. And it is convenient to divide ecology into 5 increasingly comprehensive levels. So the smallest level is the organismal level, where you're looking at single organisms. Then the next level is population ecology, and here we have a pack of wolves. And then there's community ecology, where we see a lot of predators interacting. It looks like an eagle, a bear, and a wolf. And then we have ecosystem ecology, and then lastly, global ecology. So those are the 5 levels. When we're studying organismal ecology, we're studying an individual, and that individual is what we're concerned about is how do they adapt to their environment? What is their physiology? What is their behavior? So we look at individuals. At the population level, we're concerned with factors that affect population size, the growth, and density. So if we look at a pack of wolves, we want to know what is maintaining that pack and what is the size from one year to the next. So we would look at death rates, the births of pups, and so on and so forth. When we study ecology at the community level, the focus depends on the interactions among species. So this is where we see the wolf, the bear, and the bird interacting with each other. I'm assuming that they're all predators, so they need to feed on other resources. They're next to a river, so maybe it's fish. So a community consists of multiple species and how they interact. Ecosystem ecology is concerned with the questions of energy flow and chemical recycling. So when here in this picture we see maybe a lake and we see mountains in the background, and in the middle we see we see a tree line, and there's all different kinds of trees. So here in an ecosystem, we're looking at the interactions of species with each other and also with their environment, which is the non-living part of a community. And at a global scale, ecologists can study the influence of energy and matter on organisms across the biosphere. So when we talk about atmospheric pollution, we are talking about global ecology. All organisms interact with each other and the non-living ecosystem. The ecosystem includes all living organisms as well as their non-living factors, such as air, sunlight, wind, and water. The dynamics of every ecosystem depends on 2 main processes. That first process is energy flow, and the second one is chemical cycling. So let's look at this first diagram here. And here in this diagram, what we do see is we see a cow, and the cow is foraging in a pasture. So how does all of this occur? Well, the ultimate source of energy on the surface of Earth comes from the sunlight. So we're talking about energy flow through an ecosystem. And then the plants absorb that energy, and more forage grows, and the cow eats the forage and makes more energy, and also energy leaves the system in the form of heat. It's either off of the surface of the forage or off of the surface of the cow. So we see the movement of energy going through a system, but the ultimate source was the sun. Then we can also look at chemicals moving through a system. So we have the same idyllic picture. We have a cow foraging in a pasture, but this time we're looking at the movement of CO2. CO2 is carbon dioxide. So CO2 can be converted to sugars and other molecules by producers via photosynthesis. And when I talk about producers, I'm talking about plants. And in this case, it's the forage that the cow is eating. Within the cells of the producers and consumers, sugars are broken down, providing cellular energy and then re-releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. So this would be a chemical cycle for CO2. So remember, when we're looking at ecosystems, we're concerned with energy flow and chemical cycling. Pick your favorite wild plant or animal. How would you study this species as an organismal ecologist? And how would you study this species as an ecosystem ecologist? So going back and learning over what we just did isn't it true when it's ecosystem, we're concerned with energy flow and chemical cycling? But an organismal ecologist, we're concerned with behavior, right? We're concerned with behavior and the interaction with that one individual species. The next topic is the biosphere. So the biosphere includes biotic and abiotic factors. So living organisms of an ecosystem constitute biotic factors. Abiotic factors of an ecosystem are its non-living components. Abiotic factors have a profound effect on the life within an ecosystem. Examples of abiotic factors include the supply of energy and nutrients. So the most important abiotic factor is energy. Like the sun is the ultimate source of energy on the surface of this earth. Most ecosystems on Earth are powered by solar energy via sunlight. The availability of inorganic nutrients can impact plant growth. So examples are nitrogen and phosphorus. So isn't it true that plants are producers? They're producing a lot of food and that will be consumed by consumers that are eating on them. So this would be the flow of energy and chemicals through an ecosystem. So what are some other abiotic factors? Wind, water, temperature, and fire. Regardless of the environment that you live in, all of these are concerns. And that's why when you listen to the news in the evening or early in the morning, what are one of the things that they always include? They always include the weather. They always include fire threats and the availability of freshwater supplies. How do abiotic factors shape ecosystems? How is it that rain systems differ from deserts in their abiotic factors? And how might those differences result in different biological communities? Well, the primary difference between a rainforest and a desert is the amount of water. So there's not a lot of water, and that's going to impact the type of plant and the quantity of plants that we see in a given location. So in deserts, we don't see many plants, but in a rainforest with an abundant supply of water, we see a bunch of lush growth and we see trees. Populations vary in density, dispersion, and survivorship curves. So if we're looking at population ecology, these would be the factors that we're interested in. We're interested in population density, dispersion patterns, survivorship curves, and life histories. Collecting such data can provide insights to the dynamics of a population in an ecosystem. So what is population density? Population density is the number and members of a species per unit area or volume of the habitat. You guys know that my background is in agriculture, and I was looking at a soils book, and they were saying in our desert that our desert can only feed one cattle or one cow or bull per square mile. Isn't that amazing? So one per square mile. But if there were a more lush place, then it would be different. Then we also look at dispersion patterns. So it's how individuals are spaced within a habitat. Is it clumped? Are they together, huddled together? Are they uniform, like evenly spaced out? Or is it a random pattern like you see in a pasture or a meadow full of flowers? Age structure is the number of individuals in different age groups. So we're looking at the number of individuals, but we're also concerned with the age groups and also gender. So here we see the United States age structure for at 2010 and Ethiopia's age structure for 2010. And the one thing that you can clearly see is that the average age of most Americans is 38. So we're a more mature population. We have a lot of older people and younger people, and that's why the average age is 38. Whereas when we go to Ethiopia, the average age is 17. So it's one of the questions that the slide asks is which country will need more high schools in the future? And the answer is yes, you're correct. It's Ethiopia. They have so many more young people in the population, they should be getting ready to build more high schools. Whereas in the United States, if you look at the population structure at 0 to 4, 5 to 9, and 10 to 4, notice that there's a definite decrease. So it's where we'll probably be eliminating some schools. Survivorship curves graph the percentage of individuals alive over time. So survivorship is really important. And survivorship is the chance that an individual member of a given population will live to a particular age. So you can have three shapes to a curve. So if you look at humans, and it starts up high on the graph and then just swoops down. It looks like the end of the letter N, or it looks like an elephant's trunk. And then you have survivorship is there's death all throughout, and that is a linear line going down. So it looks high at one end, and on the right hand side the age goes down in a linear manner. And then we have one where it starts off high and it dramatically drops down, and that would be for fish population. So let's go back to the first curve, the one that looks like part of the letter N. Is humans have that shape. So we live for a long time, and death rates start to increase once we get old. But then in the second picture, it looks like cormorants. Those are a bird that lives along the coast, like along California. And they have a linear, survivorship is linear. In other words, birds are dying as they age from young to old. So there's a constant rate of mortality in that group. And then fish, a lot of baby fish are born, but only few survive to be middle-aged and old-aged. What patterns do you expect? What population dispersion patterns would you expect for the following scenarios? So if we're looking at territorial songbirds on their breeding pattern, what would you say their dispersion pattern is? Is it clumped? Is it random? Or is it uniform? I think it's uniform. Trees that disperse as windblown seeds. What do you think that one is? I think that's random. And then students in a classroom, uniform. And students in a classroom, when free pizza is delivered to the front of the room, that would be clumped. Growth models can predict changes in the population size. In its simplest terms, population size is the calculation of the number of births minus the number of deaths. Ecologists have developed idealized models to help us better understand changes in population size. So, exponential population growth occurs under ideal conditions. So we're not just talking about human population. If you have an ideal population, what you're going to have is you're going to end up with a J curve. So it starts low at the very beginning, and then all of a sudden it starts reaching up higher and higher, and it looks like the letter J. So it says at first the population size is small and increases slowly. This is under ideal conditions. Then exponential growth produces more and more individuals. And then at the last part, at the exponential part, as long as resources do not run out, growth can reach a tremendous rate. So it skyrockets. So can populations keep on skyrocketing over time? I guess they could if there were more and more resources. But isn't it true? We know that resources are finite. So here's again is a larger graph of the exponential growth curve. And notice that it's J-shaped. At first it's small and low and it increases slowly. Then at some point it starts to curve up and this it produces the J-shaped growth curve. And then it starts skyrocketing up. So as long as there's resources, there's going to be an extremely high growth rate. Most populations cannot sustain exponential growth indefinitely, and that is because there are a lot of limiting factors. So in the real world, there are limiting factors and environmental constraints that put a cap on the size of a population. And so this cap is called the carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity is the maximum population size that can survive in an environment. So you have a J curve, but then it ultimately hits this carrying capacity and the population starts to level out. So when you look at the shape of the curve again, instead of it being just the J curve, it now looks like the S curve because at the top it starts to level out. It hits this point because there aren't infinite resources in any environment. So some questions are, what happens if there are factors like predators, disease, or food shortages? Over time, what do you expect will happen to population size? So for me personally, I think population size does hit near the carrying capacity, and then the population starts to level out. Okay, so this is a larger graph showing logistic growth model, and this shows the S-shaped population curve. So just like before, populations start small, and then at one point they start to exponentially grow, and that gives us the J curve. And then they keep on growing and there's an extremely high growth rate. And then all of a sudden that stops because it meets the carrying capacity of an environment with its limited resources. And then the population levels out. So when the population has reached its carrying capacity, the growth rate becomes zero and the population size stays constant. So what are some limiting factors? There's density dependent and density independent factors which limit population growth. So some examples of density dependent factors, those are those factors whose influence is affected by population density, is competition and disease. Density independent factors are unrelated to population density, and this includes weather and environmental disturbance. So, there's some women, not women, but just people in general that hoard animals. So I guess they call them collectors. And they can have so many animals that the density gets so high that disease can go through a population. I've heard of people that have like over 100 cats. So the cat population will get really high. They have cats living in every room of their house. Then they get sick and they die. And then you have a small population. And if you don't control birth rates, then the population gets high again. And then there's another cycle of disease. Or if you're out in nature, you're competing for food, so there's only limited food resources. Density independent factors are things like water and environmental disturbance. So let's say that there's a big freeze, so that's going to kill a lot of organisms out, or a prolonged drought. So this is an example of something that happened. In 1944, the U.S. Coast Guard introduced 29 reindeer to an island off of Alaska. With no natural predators, the population reached 6,000 animals by 1963, leading to concern for the island's vegetation. They were eating it all. However, by 1966, only 42 were alive. weather records show that 1964 was an exceptionally cold year. Okay, so it says here, graph the reindeer population over time. So remember, we're going to sort of see a J curve, and it's going to go from 29 to 6,000 in about 20 years, from 1944 to 1963. And then it's going to drop to down to 42. So what happened was it density dependent or density independent factors. In this case, I think it was density independent. Remember, it got so cold, then after that, only 42 deer were alive. The total human population is currently at about 7.2 billion, and it continues to rise. So the human population is growing like a J curve. It started out nice and slow, but then at some point it started to accelerate. And now, as long as we can figure out how to get resources, it seems like growth rates will be exceptionally high. If you look at this graph, growth, the human population was very low until maybe around the mid 1800s. And then after that, it started to accelerate and increase, forming the J curve. And so now we see that total population might exceed over 8 billion soon. It's projected to exceed, and annual birth rates are beginning to peak, but hopefully with education, they'll begin to decrease. Population age structure can also inform future population growth. So current population growth is affected by the birth rate at 15 to 30 years ago, since that is when today's child bearers were born. So there's an example here. So we have two age structures, one for 2010 and then another one projected for 2035. So green is for pre-reproductive years, blue is for peak reproductive years, and red is for post-reproductive years. So notice in this diagram, it almost looks like the United States, but we see actually that over time, if we go forward 15 to 30 years from now, and 2010 to 2035 is actually 25 years from now, we see that that population that was in the green will now be in their peak reproductive years. And we see that those that were in the reproductive years 25 years from now will be in their post-reproductive years. So in this particular case, we see a decline in young people, but a definite increase in older people. So the question is why are you in college, and why this question when we're talking about age structure of populations? I don't know if you knew this, but in many countries around the world, the most effective method for reducing population growth by dropping birth rates has been linked to increasing access for girls to primary and secondary schools. So when females become educated, the family size naturally declines. So why is it that education for girls is so effective in reducing the number of births per female? Does this suggest policy recommendations to help stabilize our global populations? Well, I think it does say that this does lead to policy recommendations. But why do you think education lowers birth rates? Because I think women start to realize that if they have fewer children, then that each individual child will have a greater success rate of actually becoming a contributing adult to society. When you have many children, it's hard to feed many mouths, and it's more difficult, and the probability of any single one child becoming successful becomes much lower. And I think you have to be educated to understand that. So we do have all different kinds of interactions between species, and that does play important roles in community. So within a community, species interact with members as they compete for food, water, sunlight, and living space. So here we have effect on population 1 and population 2. We have competition, mutualism, predation, herbivory, parasitism, and commensalism. So the question is what is mutualism? That means both populations are benefiting. In predation, only one population is benefiting at the expense of the other. In herbivory, again, if you're eating all of the grass and forage, one population is benefiting at the expense of another. And definitely in parasitism, if many ticks are on a dog, the poor dog is pretty much defenseless. So it's one population benefiting at the expense of another. And commensalism is one population benefits, but it has no effect on the second one. Competition occurs when two or more species rely on similar limiting resources. So if two species are going after nuts, then there's going to be a competitive exclusion principle. So competition is mutually harmful. According to the competitive exclusion principle, if the resources required by two species are too similar, they cannot coexist. So you cannot have two species wanting exactly the same resources, the same habitat, and the same food. So in this example here, we have a bear and we have a squirrel because they're both eating nuts and berries. Mutualism is a form of interspecies interaction in which both species benefit. So some examples of this is coral and algae living together. Or what about flowers and honeybees? Or what about plants, the roots, and fungus? So both are helping each other. Both benefit from the relationship. So mutualism creates symbiosis. That is, two species are living in close physical association with one another. Predation is one species is benefiting at the expense of another. So predation is an interaction in which a predator species kills and eats a prey species. And herbivory is when one species eats plant parts by an animal. So here you see it looks like a prairie dog feeding on a barrel cactus. A parasite, and here this is a mouse flea, is an animal that lives at the expense of another animal, its host, but doesn't quite kill it. It's always leeching off of it. And then we have pathogens, and pathogens can cause disease and eventually kill their host. So here you see a tree that's been attacked by chestnut blight. What happens when species compete? Imagine that two species of related birds live in the same habitat and eat similar food items. Design a simple experiment to test the competitive exclusion hypothesis. So we ultimately know that if their eating habits and their habitat is too similar, only one will be able to stay in that particular environment. Now let's talk about food webs. Food webs describe multiple trophic structures. Trophic refers to eating structures. Trophic structure describes the feeding relationships within a community. Food chains and food webs describe the transfer of organic material from one trophic level to the next. So if you're looking at a food chain, you start at the bottom, and usually at the bottom you have like single cell organisms, or you have producers, and these producers are either algae or land plants. So in this case here we see some grass, and we see some algae. And then in its second level, we have primary consumers. Well, what are primary consumers? They're the ones that are eating the plants. So we have squid larvae and we have a cricket. And then if you go up the chain, then there's going to be something that eats those animals. So in a terrestrial system, we have a chipmunk, but in an aquatic system, we'll have a shiner, and that's a bigger fish eating a smaller fish. And then if we go up in the terrestrial system, we have a bull snake eating the chipmunk and a king salmon eating the shiner fish. And then ultimately we have orcas eating the salmon. And then in the terrestrial system, we have a hawk eating the bull snake. So this shows a food chain, and this shows how food and nutrients are moved from one organism to the next. So here we have a food web, because in actuality it's not just a chain, but there are a lot of interaction. So a food web interconnects multiple food chains. So here we have grass at the bottom in this example, plants, berries, grasses, and seeds. And then the primary producers are going to be like deer, snail, ants, caterpillars, crickets, and rabbits. And then those will be eaten by robins and bears and other birds and praying mantises and chipmunks. So you see all of these interactions and the interconnectedness between different trophic levels. So we have producers, which are the grasses that convert sunlight into energy, and then we have primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and ultimately in this case a quaternary consumer, which is a great horned owl. Because of food chains and food webs, we have many toxins that concentrate within a food web or a food chain, and this is called biological magnification. Biological magnification is the tendency of toxins to become concentrated in a food web or in a food chain. So in this particular diagram here, we see mercury participation from a coal-burning power plant that is located on the coastal area. And so smoke goes out and it's taking with it a lot of mercury. But then in the cloud system with the water cycling, it starts to rain. And that rain brings down the mercury, and the mercury ends up in the ocean. Then the Atlantic mackerel starts eating organisms that have absorbed the mercury, and then the blue marlin eats the bait fish, and mercury gets concentrated in the marlin. So it can concentrate to very high levels, from 0.1 to 0.2 parts per million mercury to 0.9 to 1 parts per million mercury. Now let's talk about diversity. So here we have two pictures of a forest. We have forest A and forest B. And the question is which forest is most diverse? So what would you be looking for diversity? I would be looking at the different types of trees, right? So I'm going to count like how many different tree species there are. And I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it looks like both of them have around 4 different species, or it looks that way from what I can visually see. So I know that they have 4, but forest A in my mind sort of looks more diverse than forest B. So would you consider one forest more diverse than the other? I did, and I think it's because of the number of each type of tree. So both forests have the same number of species, or species richness. So when they talk about species richness, all they're doing is counting the number of species living in a particular environment. Now, we can look at relative abundance. Notice that the relative abundance is pretty much the same in forest A, but in forest B, the eastern hemlock is the most dominant plant. Even though there's the same number of species, they're not as abundant as they are in forest A. The other thing that we need to look at in a particular environment are keystone species. Keystone species can drive patterns of species richness and diversity. In other words, a keystone species is a species that has a disproportionately large effect on its environment relative to its abundance. So I guess I have a question for you. Are human beings a keystone species? What do you think? Think about it. So in this example here, ecologists studying the Alaskan coast discovered that a decline in the sea otter population allowed sea urchins to quickly multiply. So it looks like in this example that the sea otter is critical to controlling sea urchins. Communities are rarely static, and disturbance is followed by recolonization. So communities are changing always through time. And you know what? This looks like a picture of Mount St. Helens. Remember that the volcano erupted in 1980? I remember that. And then in 1985, it began its primary succession, then secondary, until just recently the landscape looks totally different than what it did in 1980. And this is in Washington State. So this shows that communities are rarely static, and when there's a disturbance, it's always followed by recolonization. Ecological disturbance often adds to diversity of habitats and communities. So if you're a fireman, and if you're working with the Forestry Service, they used to have controlled burns. And these controlled burns or forest fires were used to maintain ecological diversity. But when they get out of hand, then that disturbance is something else. So, but usually after a great disturbance, there's ecological succession, and it depends on the community. It could take hundreds or even thousands of years to become a diverse community once again. Why do introduced species sometimes take over? So why is it that they take over? So in 1859, 24 rabbits were released on an Australian ranch for game hunting. By 1900, the rabbit population had increased to several hundred million, spanning most of the continent. So what type of growth curve did the introduced rabbit population show? Guys, do you agree it's the J curve? Why did the population grow so rapidly? Why do you think they grew so rapidly? I think it's because they had a lot of resources and they didn't have any competitor or predator that was eating on them. Invasive species disrupt ecosystems as both predators and competitors. So when non-native organisms are introduced to a community, they can spread rapidly and they can become an invasive species. Invasive species are now a leading cause of extinctions of local communities. And one of the examples here is the lionfish. It was introduced into the Caribbean and consumed others voraciously. So it has no competitors and it's eating all of the resources. So invasive species are very dangerous. Another classic example is when we have pets that are not really domesticated and then they get too large and release them out in nature. So it's like snakes being released in nature or fish being released in nature, that they don't belong, that it's not their native habitat, and therefore they don't have any natural predator and they consume and kill all of the living organisms there and use the resources. Another one are pythons, the Burmese pythons, and these are set loose in Florida from people that were having them as pets. And these guys can even consume alligators. Another classic example is kudzu. Kudzu was brought in from Africa to be a fast-growing pasture crop for cattle, but the truth is that it grew so fast and out of control, and now you see it growing all over buildings and trees in the south. Once established, controlling invasive species can be very difficult. Can anybody think of invasive species in the Chihuahuan Desert? I can think of two. tumbleweeds, which originated, I believe, from either China or Russia. And the other one is, God, I can't think of the name. It's that tree that lives along the river and it has those little pink flowers. I'll think about it in a little bit. So we too have invasive plant species that have been brought to the Chihuahuan Desert. Ecologists may implement biological control, the intention to release a natural enemy to control the invasive species. So the example that they have is the stingless wasp, and it's used to control an insect larvae. So a stingless wasp has helped control the populations of an invasive borer that is boring into plants. So, but we have to be very careful when we use biological controls because biological control for invasive species can have unintended consequences. So one example is in Hawaii and the Caribbean, growers introduced the mongoose, a fierce hunter of rats, but unfortunately the mongoose also decimated native reptiles, amphibians, and birds. So the mongoose was brought in to control rats, but it started eating leatherback sea turtles, uh, snakes, native snakes, and actually birds. And this is the end of part 1 of chapter 12.